Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you are doing well. Well, I'm recording this in the summer, but the school year is almost upon us. So to kick off this back to school season, I thought that we would jump right back into better understanding math instruction, reading instruction, difficulties with writing, and how to support students so that they can have a successful academic year. And we're going to kick things off by talking about the best practices for math instruction. My guest today is Dr. Sarah Powell. She is a professor in the College of Education at the University of Texas at Austin and Associate Director of the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. Her research, teaching, and service focus on mathematics, particularly for students who experience mathematics differently. I am so thrilled to have Dr. Powell here with us today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social-emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Dr. Powell. It's so great to reconnect with you and have you on the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Karen, for having me here today. I'm very excited to be here with you.
I'm excited as well. And for our listeners who don't know, I first learned about your work in math when you spoke at the Help Group Summit.
It was a while ago.
It was a while ago.
Yeah.
I was a speaker there as well. And then when I was in the process of creating Child Nexus, I was reaching out to researchers who were doing great work in reading and writing and math and wanted to convey the information that you were researching in a form that parents and educators could understand. And you were gracious and wrote this wonderful blog about components of effective math instruction. And I'm going to link to it in the show notes. It's still relevant and important. And so again, like I was saying to you before we jumped on, I feel like we've come full circle. So again, so grateful to have you here.
Well, anytime we get to talk about math and just help people understand how important math is for students' success, not just in schools, but after they leave school, I'm all for it. So I'm excited to talk about math with you today.
Yay! And we know that when students excel in math, pathways to science, technology, and engineering just open up for them.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But what does that mean for students who experience difficulty with math? That's my question because of the students I work with, correct?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important one to consider. So the math pathways for students are quite strong, even from the earliest of ages. So there are several research studies out there that will look at the math performance of kids who are 3 and 4 years old and how that predicts later math. And maybe not surprising to you, but your math performance as a preschooler predicts pretty much how well you'll do in math in kindergarten. And there are several studies that will look at students' math at age 4 and 5 years old and show that it is predictive of how well you'll be doing in math as a high school student. And so if you are doing well in math, that's great. Your pathway is likely going to continue to be pretty strong for you. And I'm exactly like you, Karen. I really focus on students who are experiencing that difficulty with math. And so when students do have difficulty with math, it doesn't mean that they have to stay on that pathway, but there is some chance that if they struggle with math at kindergarten, that they're going to continue to struggle with math at first grade and second grade and third grade. And why that is because math is so cumulative. So your math skill or math performance at any grade level, let's say kindergarten, that is important for first grade math. Like you cannot be successful with first grade math if you have not been successful with kindergarten math. And then let's say you weren't that great at kindergarten math and first grade math, and now you're in fourth grade. Well, then that's going to put up some barriers to you that really don't need to be in place, particularly if schools and teachers and caregivers have good support of these students early who struggle with math. And so the pathways, when we look at that research that shows those pathways are pretty strong, that doesn't take into account school intervention efforts of identifying students who are struggling with math, providing them targeted intervention. And so we do know that we can change the pathways for these students, but we just have to be thinking about doing this all the time, because maybe you didn't struggle with kindergarten math, you did okay there, but now you're in fifth grade and things are a little bit harder for you. So we can't just only focus on the early grades and intervention there, but we have to think about there are likely students at every grade level, pre-K to 12, who may require more targeted support than is being provided to them in their general education math classroom.
Right. And that's because, like you're saying, you're building on skills at each
Yes.
level.
Yep.
And that research also lets me know that there are opportunities to intervene when you see that very young children don't have that number awareness and all of the early building blocks to math.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things, not every school does this, but we see that a lot of schools, particularly in that pre-K to grade 3 range, are really focused on reading. And that reading is important. I'm not going to say don't pay attention to reading anymore. But really, our schools will say we have a dedicated reading block. I was recently working with a school district that had 8 reading interventionists and 1 math interventionist. And so we can tell they're investing a lot in reading, and that's very important. But math is also, I will say, just as important. And the earlier we intervene, the easier it's going to be for students later on, given that cumulative nature of mathematics. So if we are thinking about students who, as you say, have difficulty with number sense, or maybe they're having a hard time with a counting sequence or counting objects, let's intervene with them at that point, so that then they can go on and be successful with addition and subtraction, because addition and subtraction require a ton of counting skill. And then if you're pretty good with addition and subtraction, that's going to help later on with your multiplication and division and so on.
Right. And that's why high quality math instruction is so critical to students,
Yes.
particularly those who are experiencing those difficulties with math at any level. And it seems that when we intervene early, we're ensuring that all students have the opportunity to excel in mathematics.
Yes, agreed. And it's really opening doors to students. There's, I would say, several different doors or maybe gates that students pass through in math in their career in school. So this early idea of number sense that opens up the door to doing well with addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. If you do well there, that opens up the door to being able to be successful with fractions and decimals. And then many people describe fraction knowledge as opening up the door to being successful with algebra. And then algebra opens up the door to higher level math. But at any point when that door is even just closed a little bit, or for some students, it's pretty almost shut, then that holds students back. And that gets back to that idea you introduced at the beginning of making sure that all of our students are adequately prepared for math so that they have an open door to STEM careers if they want it, or pretty much every career that you can think of on earth involves some understanding of mathematics. And so we want to make sure that those doors are open to students and we don't hold them back.
Absolutely. And you discuss, 5 basic practices, or best practices rather, for math instruction. Yeah. And one of your key practices focuses on the language of mathematics. Can you talk about what that is, why math vocabulary is so important?
Yeah, great. So it's always fun to talk about math, but focus on language, right? That's not probably where all of your listeners thought we were going to go with this initially. So there is a language of mathematics, and many times that might be the symbols, like the plus sign or the minus sign, the equal sign, the numbers like the numeral 3 or the numeral 14. That's a language right there. But then there's this entire written and oral language that students have to understand to be successful with math. So let's just say we're thinking about fractions. So I have to talk about this numerator and this denominator. I have this fraction. This fraction represents a whole divided into equal parts. Right there, we talked about fraction, numerator, denominator, whole, equal parts. When I said whole, probably many of your listeners, they knew I was talking about fractions, right? So they were thinking about a whole, WHOLE, but many of our students, they might think about a hole that you're digging into the ground, right? And so there's a lot of math language that has multiple meanings, not just in the math classroom, but outside of the math classroom. And if we are not focusing on this language, and by focusing, I'll say explicitly teaching this vocabulary in addition to the numbers and symbols of math, then we're going to have students that don't fully understand math as we are reading, as we are writing, as they are listening to peers and their teachers talk about math. All of that is language based. And so, really, every math teacher needs to consider themselves a language teacher of mathematics. And at every grade level, we see that there's hundreds of math vocabulary terms that students have to understand in order to be able to fully engage and participate in the math classroom. So that language piece is important. And I would suggest that with educators and with caregivers, really focusing on that first. Do you know what numerator and denominator mean? And then now we can apply that to this learning of fractions. And what does the word fraction mean? And what comes to mind when you hear these terms, so that students then can be successful with the math. I think that if I talk to my mom and dad about math, they would think math's just numbers and symbols. But math is this entire, hundreds, if not thousands, of vocabulary terms embedded within sentences and paragraphs that we have to be able to understand in order to understand those math concepts and procedures.
And that likely explains why so many students who struggle with language, who have language-based learning differences or challenges, also struggle with math.
Agreed. We have, many students have challenges in the classroom, and maybe some of those are difficulties with language. We have students that have difficulty with reading. We have students that have difficulty with writing. We also have, at least where I am in Texas, a large number of bilingual learners in our classrooms. And so when we see that students are experiencing difficulty with math, maybe they are having a hard time with math concepts and procedures, but it also could be embedded within this idea of the language. Do they understand the language of math? Can they read fluently in mathematics? Can they write fluently in mathematics? And can they speak fluently to share their ideas in mathematics? So anytime we have a student in the classroom who has any type of difficulty, I think we should be asking ourselves, how might that interfere with the learning of mathematics?
Yes. You also emphasize the use of multiple representations in math instruction. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, so when I think about multiple representations, I'm thinking about multiple ways to help students represent math. And so a lot of times that might be through hands-on tools that students can touch and move around to do different things in mathematics. So this might be rolling dice. This might be using counters like counting bears. That's a very popular concrete tool. It might be using fraction tiles. It could also be using the base 10 blocks. That's another very popular tool of the hundreds that are available out there. Representations could also be drawings. Maybe students are drawing a number line or drawing a picture or drawing tick marks. Representations could also include, there's an entire world of virtual math manipulatives now, which is great, many of which are free. So there's virtual geoboards where students can show different geometric and fraction concepts with the geoboard. There's virtual counters, there's virtual money and virtual time manipulatives. And the idea is that we use these multiple representations so that students really understand the math. Because a lot of students can get pretty good understanding of the math if we are just working with those numbers and symbols. But what if we show students that, if I line up these 10 ones, that's the same as 110? Well, that can help students have a visual for what it means to regroup. Or maybe students could draw circles and then put the same number of, we'll say, squares in each circle. That could be a representation of multiplication. Students could draw fractions. And there's also a lot of really good representations for understanding algebra. And the more that we pull in these multiple representations, the more likely it is that students will develop I would say, a deeper understanding
Right.
of the mathematics, which is what we're trying to help students establish. We don't want that superficial understanding of mathematics. We really want students to understand the math, what the math means, both the concepts of math and the procedures that accompany those concepts.
And those multiple representations of math and those hands-on learning examples that you gave also mean multiple representations in the brain. And that all combined to help students grasp mathematical concepts better.
Yeah, and there's this whole idea of, can you work the same problem in different ways, right? So can I do 2 plus 3 where if it's just written with the numbers and symbols, but can I draw 2 plus 3? Can I show 2 plus 3 with food or with manipulatives, or I've got some pens on my desk? Could I show 2 plus 3 in that way? And then, yeah, we're making these deeper connections so that students have a good understanding of what it actually means to add 2 plus 3. It's not just memorization, but there's this connection to the understanding that we're trying to establish as well.
Before I continue with my conversation with Dr. Powell, I want to tell you about one of our Child Nexus partners, Park Century School. For over 56 years, Park Century School's mission has been empowering bright children in grades K through 8 with language-based learning differences such as dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and ADHD. Park Century works to help students flourish with a tailored evidence-based curriculum and supportive environment. For more information, please visit the Park Century School website at parkcenturyschool.org. Now back to my conversation with Dr. Powell. Systematic and explicit instruction is another practice you highlight. Can you talk about what that entails?
Yeah, so being systematic with your instruction means a lot of different things, but maybe one of the easier interpretations of that is to think about sequencing skills so that easier skills are learned before more difficult skills. And that makes a lot of sense. Again, back to that idea that math is cumulative. So easy or earlier math impacts your later math. When we're explicit with our instruction, we're going to be really thoughtful about how we teach math to students. So there's a lot of research out there, particularly for students who are struggling with math, to say that we need to provide those students with a model for how to set up and solve a specific type of math problem. And then part of explicit instruction is giving students lots of practice opportunities where they're practicing with an adult, whether that's the educator or a caregiver, and they're getting a lot of feedback on that. So this is providing a lot of scaffolding to students as they are learning something new. And then, as another part of that, is making sure that we're giving students a lot of opportunity to dialogue and share their ideas about mathematics, so that if we have to fine tune the instruction, we can go back and reteach or we can move on. But we really just want to be in constant communication with the students so that we understand, what are they understanding? And then when is it time to move on to the next more complex thing? So systematic is being very thoughtful with the design of our instruction and the sequencing of our instruction. And then being explicit means, to me, doing a lot of modeling, engaging students in a lot of practice opportunities, and then embedding feedback into that modeling and practice so that students are always with us and responding so that we can fine tune the instruction as needed.
Right. And it seems like during that practice, you're getting a lot of feedback from the students in terms of how they're doing, what are they responding to, where are their gaps, so that you can provide the appropriate level of support they need to better understand what you're teaching them.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also helping us know, where are there errors that seem to be kind of like continual errors. So a lot of times people call that a bug instead of just a slip. Like sometimes, oops, yeah, you accidentally added those numbers together and came to an incorrect sum. But do you do that all the time? Then that's going to be really ripe for instruction. If you were just a little careless today and you do know that 8 plus 7 is 15 instead of 16, then I might not want to focus my instruction on that if I know that that's just like a little slip. But if it is a bug in your thinking, then that's going to help me inform my instruction either later today, tomorrow, next week, and so on.
Right. The other thing I was thinking about when I was looking through the work that you're doing is the similarities. And you talked about this when we started about reading and math and the emphasis in terms of early instruction. And even when you were talking about explicit instruction, we know that, again, like math, like reading has to be explicitly taught. It's not something you just acquire like language.
Yeah. Yeah. It
And
isn't magical, right?
right.
Well, and even language is modeled and practiced, right? So as you are hearing adults in your home environment, and then you start to say those sounds, and you like kind of start to practice with your mouth how do I say mom? Oh, because I've heard it 600,000 times, right? So I think. I don't think, but what research says is that really everything around us is modeled and practiced, and that is true for reading, that is true for mathematics, and that is really just true for our general life. And so, if we can take a lot of what we know from cognitive science in terms of how people learn new things and apply it with a mathematical lens, then that would tell us that we do need to set students up for success with a little model. And then that practice is where the learning occurs. So we need to engage students in sometimes 5, 10, 15, 20 practice opportunities so that they learn that content, become comfortable with it, and then we can go on to the next thing and layer in that previous knowledge with what we are about to learn.
Right. And that practice you talk about really speaks to kind of the next, best practice is math fluency. And I think that people are familiar with reading fluency and even writing fluency, when we think of speed and accuracy of reading and writing, but fluency with math is often misunderstood, yet it's essential for student success.
It is, yeah. So, and I liked how you talked about that speed and accuracy, because that is the same thing in mathematics. So when we think about fluency is not memorization, right? There's parts of fluency that will track toward memorization eventually, but we're not just asking students to memorize everything in math. There are things in math that are really helpful to memorize. So it is helpful to know the counting sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's really helpful to know that a nickel has a value of 5 cents versus a dime that has a value of 10 cents, right? And you do end up just having to memorize those things. But there's also a lot of fluency in mathematics that I would never ask people to memorize. For example, what is 1,561 plus 79? Or what is 23 times 47? Like, those are things that you don't memorize, but you want to have an efficient route to solving those problems. And so there is some part of speed. If I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's going to help me. That speed is going to help me with later mathematics. But I also want to arrive at an accurate response, right? I want to know that 2 plus 3 is 5, or whatever the math problem is. So in fluency in mathematics, fluency occurs through practice. Like you were saying, it isn't innate. We only get better at writing, we only get better at reading, and we only get better at math by practicing, whether that's practicing counting. A big conversation out there in fluency is always around the math facts. So 2 plus 3, 11 minus 6, 6 times 5, and so on. But then there's fluency beyond that. How fluently can you solve an equation like 2x minus 3 equals 7, right? So I want to have some efficiency there and develop some speed with that eventually, but I also want to have accuracy with being able to solve that problem correctly. So fluency is really everywhere in mathematics, I would say, from just the earliest counting through working with algebra and trigonometry and calculus. But if we don't carve out time to help students practice and develop that fluency, it isn't going to happen magically. And so that's why we need to develop into the school day routines where we take these 2 minutes or these 5 minutes and we do some fluency practice, whether that's through games or partner activities, or it could even be individual work for the students. But that practice develops that fluency. And then what we do know is that when students have fluency in math, like they're able to count fluently, they're able to multiply fluently, or they're able to identify common denominators of fractions fluently, that makes math easier. And when math is easier for students, then they can go on back to that whole idea of cumulative math. Then they can be successful with later math in an easier way. It also helps Fluency also helps remove some of the barriers to math that students might have that are more cognitive in nature. So there might be some students that struggle with working memory. Well, if I don't have to stop and count out, well, what is 8 plus 7? If I just know 8 plus 7 is 15, that helps me move through the problem in a quicker way. And I don't have to stop everything and do the calculation. And there's also this entire idea that I know has been on your podcast before around cognitive load. And so trying not to overwhelm students' cognitive load. So when students have fluency in mathematics, it just makes things easier for them.
Yes, it makes things easier and they make fewer errors. And I think about students who I see solving a problem like a 5 times 4 and they're drawing 5 ticks 4 times and then they forget
actually,
one. Yes.
Yep, now they say it's 19.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there's so many examples of that. We do a lot of work in schools with students, particularly around grades 3 through 8. And we see late elementary students and middle school students still using some of these strategies that are fine to use in kindergarten and first grade, like tick marks, but they're still using them. And then often they'll try to be drawing tick marks to show something like, 5 times 6 or 8 times 9, and just your likelihood of making a mistake, even counting up. And then they'll say, 8 times 9 is 73 instead of 72. And if they just had that fluency there, knowing 8 times 9 is 72, it would just make the math easier. And then they could go on and do the more complicated problem that we know is coming up for those students.
Right. Which really speaks again to that whole idea of having these foundational skills so that you can build on those for more complex mathematical tasks.
Yeah. Math is entirely cumulative.
Yes. And the 5th practice involves, focusing on word problems, which is a common challenge for many students, particularly those with language-based learning challenges. Are there strategies that are particularly helpful for teaching students to effectively approach and solve math word problems?
Yeah. Great question. And you're exactly right. Word problem solving is really hard for many students. And it's a barrier for many students because many, in every state in the United States right now, students show off what they know about math through word problem solving. And so if students have difficulty with language or reading or comprehension of these word problems, then they're not showing off what they know about math, right? So it holds students back. So your question about what are some of the ways that we can support students with word problem solving? Well, it'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the one thing that is not helpful, and that is using keywords to solve word problems. So how this happens is some educators or maybe even caregivers, you can find these easily on the internet. There's these keyword posters out there. And on these keyword posters, you'll see an operation like addition. And then it will have a lot of words that mean addition, maybe total, sum, all together. And so then what students do is they try to find that keyword in the word problem. So let's say they say they see total in a word problem and they think, oh, every time I see total, I need to add. Well, then they just add the numbers from the word problem. And, in a few word problems, that would help them solve the problem correctly. But in a lot of word problems, it's actually not going to help them solve the word correctly, particularly when we get to multi-step word problems, which really start to be pretty prevalent around grades 3 and 4. So we don't want to use keywords tied to operations, but instead there are 2 suggestions that I would have, and we actually do those at the same time. The first is to use what we can call a metacognitive strategy. I often just call it an attack strategy, but it's just a way to attack a word problem. And there's a lot of these out there, but one of the ones that I like to use the most with our students is understand, plan, solve, check, or UPS check. And so the idea is that if you see this word problem, it's this jumble of numbers and words. Oof, I don't know what to do with this. Well, first thing, let's understand it. All right. Then we make a plan. Then we solve, and then we go back and check our work. So an attack strategy helps students start to think about, how do I attack this problem? And then the other thing that we have found really helpful is to focus a lot on the concepts that are embedded within these word problems. And often this brings up a whole conversation around what they call schemas. A schema is just a problem type or the structure to a word problem. And believe it or not, across grades K through 8, there are really 6 word problem schemas that students see regularly in their word problem solving. There are 3 across grades K through 2. There are 5 across grades K through 5, and then there are 6 across grades K through 8. And if we help students recognize these concepts or these schemas, like, oh, this is a problem where I'm comparing amounts, or this is a problem where I'm putting together amounts. When students can recognize that schema, it doesn't matter if I'm doing 2 plus 3 or 26 plus 75 or 1/3 plus 2/3, the schema remains the same. And so if students can recognize, oh, this is a problem where I'm putting things together. I know how to solve a problem where I put things together. Or, hey, this is a problem where I compare 2 amounts. I've done a problem like that before. I can compare 2 amounts. It helps make word problem solving easier and more accessible for students when they realize that there aren't thousands of different word problems out there and that we're trying to trick them every time, because it feels like that, particularly if you struggle with the comprehension of the problem in addition to the math of the problem. But if we take that attack strategy and then we combine it with a focus on those concepts or those schemas, it really just helps students see that there's only a few different types of problems out there. And once they know how to solve that type of problem, it makes word problem solving much more digestible for kids.
Right. And that also helps parents and educators, when they have these tools, that they can help students to, again, when you talk about understanding, planning, solving, and then checking their work, parents can reinforce that at home as well.
They can reinforce that at home. And probably a lot of parents and caregivers might say, I don't really know how to help my kid with these word problems. Well, if anything, you could say, hey, let's read this problem together. Okay, what's this story about? What do we have to focus on in this story? Okay, what's your plan? And then now solve it. And then let's go back and check your work, right? So even parents or caregivers that don't feel really confident about their own math, they could help guide their students there. Oh, tell me about your plan. Tell me about how you're going to solve this. Tell me about how you would go and check your work. And I think another thing is talking about what's going on in this story. Did you see a story where are we putting things together? Is this a story where we're comparing amounts? Is this a story where there's groups and we have the same number in each group? Like, we have these very consistent schemas. And so you could be helping a kindergartner, a 2nd grader, a 4th grader, 6th grader, 8th grader, and you could be doing the same thing. Let's understand, plan, solve, and check. And let's just talk about what's going on in this story. The math may get more complex, but those concepts stay the same.
Right. And it seems with these best practices, having parents, know that these are best practices. And again, this cumulative impact of learning math, that there are different ways that they can support their children's learning of math at home and reinforce, like you're saying, these best practices.
Yeah, agreed. And, not every parent or caregiver probably wants to consider themselves a math teacher, but they can do a lot they could teach math, but they could be a math supporter, right? So sitting down and reading these word problems together and just talking, oh, this story's about strawberries. What are they doing in the strawberries? Oh, they're picking strawberries. So do you think you're going to have more strawberries if you've picked a bunch of strawberries, or do you think you're going to have fewer strawberries? Things like that. Do a lot of games. So anytime you're playing, pretty much most games have math in them, whether we're playing Candyland or Chutes and Ladders, or maybe they're playing Monopoly or something with their kids. There's so much math in those games, and talking about, well, what are we doing if you're adding $100 plus $100? How much? Oh, now you have $200. Oh, yeah, that's right. When you add, that's what happens here. And so games, and even setting the table is practicing counting. Oh, there's 4 people in our family. So that means I need to get out 4 forks and 4 spoons and 4 plates and 4 napkins. That's practicing counting, and a whole idea of counting called one-to-one correspondence. And so math is really everywhere. And there's also another thing that I know probably a lot of parents and caregivers are doing, and that's reading storybooks with their kids, bedtime stories. And probably, believe it or not, there are thousands of storybooks out there that have math as a focus. A lot of them talk about counting, but there's hundreds of books out there that talk about fractions and geometry and measurement and millions and billions and all kinds of things in math. And so as you go to the library, pick out storybooks that your kids are interested in, but also think about, what's the math in this storybook? There's a lot of storybooks about talking about what are triangles and circles and squares and what is a rectangular prism. There's storybooks about that. So every once in a while, it doesn't have to be every night, but maybe reading some of these storybooks so that you can be talking about the math. Oh, how many shoes is the caterpillar wearing on this page? Let's count them together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like that's another way that helps with that language piece, that helps with the math piece, and that also helps the parent and the child really connect and talk about math in ways that might not, they don't have to be superficial.
Right. I love those examples. And I love cooking too and baking.
Oh, that's
I think
all math.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
And then when you talk about the multiple representations, you can actually see it, particularly if you have like a measuring cup and you see them go to the half line or the quarter line, you can actually see.
Well, play around with math, like take your 1/3 cup and say like, how many 1/3 cups are in one cup? Let's put water in there. Let's pour it in, right? Oh, 3. So there's 3 1/3 cups in one cup. All right. What about if we have 1/4 of a cup? What do you think, right? So there is just so much. I mean, math is everywhere, really. But so much you can do with math that's fun so that students really see that there's like a joy to math, and math can also help you solve a lot of problems. Like how many batches of brownies can I make if I need 1/3 of a cup of sugar for each batch? And I've got only 1 cup of sugar.
Right.
Let me figure that out.
I just love that. I love the example, but I love math. So I'm a math nerd.
I love it. Yes, so great.
And it seems like these strategies and these best practices are helpful for all students, not just students who are struggling with math, that these are things that can be incorporated into every classroom setting and every home to help students learn math.
100%. What works for our learners who are struggling with math is also important for all of our learners. And in our classrooms right now in the United States, we are seeing that the majority of students are not performing at what we would consider a minimum level of math proficiency. And so, maybe the classroom teacher hasn't said anything, maybe the students just kind of like floating by in math, but they probably need some targeted support in math, maybe all the time or just sometimes. And kind of going back to the idea that I talked about a little bit earlier, many of these strategies that we've talked about here in this podcast, these really come from cognitive science about how people learn. And that's not how struggling learners learn, but just how all learners learn. And we've been putting a lens on it for students who are experiencing math with some difficulty. But yeah, it is important that all students are using representations. All students should be focusing on the language of math and learning that language. All students should be engaged in fluency building. All students should be practicing the setting up and solving of word problems regularly. And we also need to be, when new content is on the horizon, we need to make sure that we're modeling and practicing that content.
These are such valuable insights, I think, to parents, to educators, to allied professionals. And I'm just so grateful for this conversation. And just thank you for all the work you're doing to improve math outcomes for students, and particularly those who struggle with math. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about math, and not just, on this podcast episode, but others, because math really does open doors for students. But when students struggle with math, it might close some of those doors. And we really don't want that to happen to any learner in the United States and really across the world. So we need to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to make sure that all students have a strong foundation in mathematics so that those doors open up and students can go and be the successful human beings that we know they can be.
Completely agree. Dr. Powell, if listeners want to get in touch with you to learn more about your work, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
Oh, well, if you want to connect with me personally, email me is the best way. But we have a lot of resources, and maybe I'll share some of those with you. We've got a lot of very teacher and parent-friendly resources around word problem solving and representations. My team and I have made hundreds of videos about how to use different representations to help students understand math concepts. And I've also made an entire free math course for the National Center on Intensive
Oh,
Intervention
wonderful.
that people can access. It's all video-based with these embedded activities. So if they want to know more about supporting learners who experience difficulty with math, they can access that free course as well. So I'll share all of those resources with you so that you can put them in the podcast description, and then people can access those.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll be sure, again, to put those in the show notes.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. I appreciate you being here and just love this conversation.
Hey, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, it was so nice to chat with you today. Thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you so much for joining me today for another episode of Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. Be sure to check out the show notes. There you will find information about Dr. Powell and how to connect with her. And she provided a number of links to free resources, a free course about providing math intervention to students, free materials for the teaching of math, and free materials for the teaching of word problem solving. So be sure to check out those show notes. Also, be sure to get on our email list at childnexus.com. There you will find resources, information about webinars, and all the answers in one place, created with the help of our Child Nexus professionals. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.